Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Joseph Henrich. He's professor and chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. He is interested in the question of how humans evolved from being a relatively unremarkable primate a few million years ago to the most successful species on the globe, and how culture affected our genetic development. He is the author of The Secret of Our Success and a new upcoming book that will be released in September, The Weirdest People in the World. So, Dr. Eric, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a huge honor to everyone. I'm a big fan of yours. So,
Oh, thank you. It's great to be with you.
okay, great. What I find most interesting about your work is that you never or you try never to tackle issues from one single perspective, like, for example, the perspective of cultural anthropology or evolutionary psychology or even economics. You try to combine them all as most as you can, of course. So, why do you think is so important for us to try to bring together all these different disciplines and branches of science to try to better understand and shed light on aspects of human psychology and human behavior like the ones we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, well, what I found pretty early in graduate school was that all the important questions, the questions about human cooperation and economic behavior and decision making, and lots of other really important questions, were being asked in many different disciplines at the same time. So one of the first things I was trying to do was understand human decision making, right? How do people decide how much wheat to plant, or where to put their gardens, or just very simple things, how to cooperate. And I found, there was a field, I was in economic anthropology at the time thinking about that. But then I began to look into psychology, and there was lots of work on economic decision making. So I started to read the work of Kahneman and Tversky, learn about biases and heuristics. And there's also economic sociology. So there was an economic sociologist that I connected with at UCLA when I was a grad student. And of course, there's the whole discipline of economics, and I started reading behavioral economics, and that seemed like that had a lot to offer. So it seemed to me that the disciplines, things like anthropology, sociology, economics, were just historical products, and that there was no sense in which they matched up to the questions or the problems that we have to tackle as scientists interested in human behavior and psychology. So I just began drawing on all the other disciplines freely and without regard to discipline. And I just tried to produce products that I thought would be of interest. And that can be a big disadvantage, but one of the tricks I found is that if you produce something that's not of interest to one discipline, maybe you can find another discipline to shop it to.
Yeah, sure. And it's interesting because, at least at first sight, some of these disciplines, like, for example, cultural anthropology and evolutionary psychology, at least from a traditional perspective, would seem to be in conflict, at least regarding some of their basic tenets. I know that's not completely true, at least with modern cultural anthropology. I've already had some people on the show with whom I discussed that kind of stuff, but do you get into that kind of issue sometimes when doing your work? That possibly some of the basics of one discipline or the other are somewhat in conflict with another,
Oh, well,
or not?
for sure. So for sure. And so, I mean, one of the advantages of studying cultural evolution and working across disciplines is you begin to realize that different disciplines are little subcultures, right? So they bring unconscious assumptions to the work that comes from having grown up in economics or having grown up in cultural anthropology. They have certain ways of answering questions. They have certain kinds of methods that are acceptable. So in economics, for example, you might want to run behavioral experiments or gather a large data set. You're going to analyze it with regression techniques of very specific kinds. In cultural anthropology, you're going to go live among the people, learn the language, have a lot of open-ended interviews, but you might not do very many statistics at the end. I mean, a typical mainstream cultural anthropology. And I think these can both be valuable sources of insight. So I've tried to integrate those to answering the kinds of questions that I'm interested
Mm, yeah. So let's get into some more specific topics. I would like to ask you about the evolution of cultural evolution? Because I guess that when we talk about evolution, people immediately associate it with natural selection and with genetic evolution, but in your work you put a lot of emphasis on cultural evolution as well, and on gene culture coevolution, for example. But for us to be able to produce culture, to transmit culture, and to process culture, we had to evolve at least some mental mechanisms, right? And so cultural evolution is something that, so to say, evolved from natural selection. Is that correct?
Well, that's certainly what I think. And so it gets past one of the most pernicious dichotomies, I think, in our efforts to create an integrated, interdisciplinary understanding of humans, which is that there's this way of thinking where it's kind of nature-nurture. So we put evolutionary and genetic explanations on one side and learning socialization explanations on the other. But what we can do with the state-of-the-art now, ideas come from Boyd and Richardson and Cavalli, Swartz, and Feldman, Kevin Leyland and others, is we apply the logic of natural selection of evolutionary thinking to think about our capacities for learning from others. So how has natural selection shaped our minds so we can be better learners? So we know when to rely on our own experience, when we learn from others, who in our cultural milieu we pay attention to, what kinds of ideas we're attracted to, and how we integrate information from different people.
Mm-hmm. And that's basically a summary of some of the main biases in learning that we have in learning and in cultural transmission and things like that, correct?
Yeah, so it's the who, what, and when of cultural learning, and then this process by selectively selecting certain kinds of content, certain kinds of individuals, we give rise to this gradually adaptive process that then has built the world that shaped our genes. So it's a culturally constructed world that then picks out very specific kinds of genes that help us adapt to that world. And I think this has shaped our basically from our toes to our heads, including giving us a nuchal ligament, shaping our feet, shortening our colons, shrinking our teeth, shrinking our stomachs, and possibly shaping our minds to allow us to navigate a norm-governed world.
Mm-hmm. And these biases that you mentioned, are they human universals or not? I mean, can we find them in every or almost every single culture that we've already studied in the world?
Well, so there is some evidence. There's some evidence that at least you find weak forms of these bias in quite diverse societies. Now, we have nothing like a full accounting of different societies, but we have societies that are very different, where people still seem to use cues of success or prestige, other kinds of cues to figure out who to learn from. We also have evidence from non-human animals. So while non-human animals have nothing like our degree of reliance on culture or the amount of complexity of culture that humans can take in, Kevin Leyland, for example, has experiments on fish showing that they use something like conformist transmission. So you'll hear arguments that this stuff is not genetically evolved or not innately evolved, but that has to go up against the fact that we see it in non-human species, we see it in children less than 1 year old, and we found it in a number of diverse societies.
Mm-hmm. So those are some of the criteria that you take into account when you're deciding that, for example, something has a genetic basis or not, or is acquired.
Yeah.
For example, the fact that early on in development, babies already show those kinds of biases, that we can also find them in other animal models and other things like that. Right.
Exactly. So you can triangulate in on it to increase the case. Now, one of the mistakes that I think is often made is to distinguish innate from learning. So I imagine these to be reliably learned or reliably acquired biases. I mean, there might be priors, the way you would have priors in a kind of Bayesian updating system. But in the same way that humans learn to walk or learn to have sex or figure those things out by experience or by observing others, humans can also learn these biases. But that doesn't mean there hasn't been selection to make them reliably developing, so that we reliably learn how to walk, we reliably learn how to become conformist learners, and that allows us to adapt to different environments. So we might have, wouldn't be surprised at all if we found that some populations had stronger conformist transmission, say tendency to copy the majority, than other populations. I would expect that. But that doesn't provide any evidence against the idea that these things are reliably developing features of humans.
Mm-hmm. So let me see if I can articulate this question correctly. Do we have any evidence that during the lifetime of individuals, culture can alter or shape something like these biases? Because I would imagine that this is something that occurs at such a basic level that it has to do really with information processing and how the brain processes information, and not really about the specific content that we can learn through those biases. Am I correct?
Yes, but it's my view that our capacities for cultural learning can also shape our information processing. Okay. So it can cause us to pay attention to some information over others. So take a simple thing like reinforcement learning. So in non-human animals, we can teach them by reinforcement learning by using food. But I could teach undergraduates through reinforcement learning by giving them money. And I can't teach a fish through giving them money. So what I've done is I've created a new currency for which I can reward the species. So that means I can shape their basic reward circuitry. They're taking new input as what they count as a reward. And I think we can also do that with cultural learning. So we can shape how information is processed, what individuals pay attention to. In fact, there's interesting research using eye tracking, showing how people raised in different societies pay attention to different things in the environment, which means you're actually shaping what kinds of information comes in.
Mm-hmm. And that has to do with things also like, for example, perception, color perception. I mean, the way people orient themselves in space, even how they think, that thing about analytic versus holistic thinking. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about here, for example.
Yeah, I mean, you can, visual illusions, colors, a whole range of things.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so the visual illusions are also not universal?
Yeah, so take something like the Muller-Lyer illusion. So that's the two triangles. So you have a line with the arrows in or the arrows out. Yeah. And if you do it with people who grow up in the kinds of visual environments that we grow up in Western societies and lots of other industrialized societies now, you have to make the line with the arrows in, you have to make it about 20% longer than the other line before people perceive it as the same length. But if you go to hunter-gatherer societies, people see them as the same length and the arrows don't create an illusion. And there's a whole range of societies in between. Mm-hmm. So this is work done in the 1960s, but it's still possible to look at textbooks in cognitive psychology and see that given as a reliably developing feature of human cognition instead of a cultural peculiarity of modern society.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the ways by which we can disentangle genetic from cultural evolution? Because, we have genetic evolution, we have cultural evolution, then we also have gene-culture co-evolution. So what are the ways by which we can try to figure out if a particular mental mechanism that we have or that we are endowed with was the result of genetic evolution, cultural evolution, or a mix of the two?
Yeah, so for that, you want to combine comparative data comparing different populations of humans, data from child development also comparing different populations of humans, and non-humans. Mm-hmm. And of course now we have ancient DNA. So we can look at the DNA in ancient humans, modern humans, and non-human primates to see which genes they share. And so that's the kind of thing we can use to triangulate in on that. So if you have, say, a certain mental ability or cognitive skill, say dealing with non-numerical quantities, so kind of piles of stuff, you can find that non-humans are pretty good at that, young children are good at that, equally in every society, and then adults. So that begins to look like something that's human universal. But if you do something like adding 16 and 32, unless you've been trained in math, that's a hard problem. You do a kind of by piles, that looks like about that much, that looks like about that much. Non-humans can't do that, children can't do that. So that's a cultural product. So you can, I'd always start by picking the easy ones, and then you get to the harder stuff.
Yeah, and since we've already mentioned animal models as one source of evidence, do you think, or I mean, what is your position when it comes to the question of other animals also having culture? Do you agree that there are other animals out there that also have culture, but not the same way that we do? Like, for example, they lack cumulative. They don't have cumulative cultural evolution. They don't accumulate things over time and evolve them or step by step like we do, or do you think
Yeah.
that that is not even a thing, that other animals do not have culture at all?
Yeah, so I think there's good evidence that non-humans can do lots of kind of social learning. As I mentioned, even fish seem to have some of the biases that come out of the evolutionary models. This is actually an interesting case because so much of our efforts to apply human evolutionary theory to humans involve taking ideas from non-human biologists, from evolutionary biology, and applying it to humans. But in the case of the fish and the thinking about social learning, the models are first developed with humans. And then, oh, voila, it turns out that the non-humans have some of this stuff. So that's been a nice way to test them, seeing that sticklebacks have conformist transmission, for example. Um, but then do they have cumulative culture? I would say there's not very good evidence for cumulative culture. It might turn out they have a little bit. They can accumulate some things. Maybe they can aggregate it. I haven't seen a good example of something that a non-human does that no single individual could figure out in its lifetime. So that's kind of the standard definition of cumulative. So I can't make an iPhone for you, but I use iPhones and I can use lots of products that I couldn't have figured out myself. Yeah, but if it turned out that some species had a little bit of cumulative cultural evolution, that would be fine. I would expect there to be a little bit of at least dabbling at the edges there for sure.
Yeah. So let's talk about a very specific topic now that is one of the main ones from your work, the evolution of cooperation. Because this is a very controversial one, I think, because there are many different approaches out there. Just to name a few to explain the evolution of human cooperation, people talk about kinship, reciprocity, reputation, signaling, and punishment. Then there are also culture, gene, coevolutionary hypotheses like self-domestication and norm psychology. And then there's also the role played by religions, rituals, marriage systems, and other kinds of institutions. So, what is your take on this topic? The human cooperation as we have it nowadays, do you think it was mainly the product of genetic evolution, cultural evolution, or is this not even the correct question to ask here?
Well, I think one of the things is the way I think about it, there's lots of different evolutionary mechanisms that we see at play in contemporary human behavior and contemporary psychology. So, for example, cooperation in the sense that mothers love their children, or the cooperation that occurs between families, seems to be pretty good evidence that some kin selection has shaped our minds, and that we're particularly orienting help towards those who are likely to share our genes from transmission by a recent common ancestor. And reciprocity seems to be something recurrent. So there's definitely something about human psychology that seems to be recurrent, develops relatively young in children. We see some precursors in non-human primates. Looks like there's good fertile ground there for something like a reciprocity psychology. I think and lots of people I think would agree with me on that. So there's probably some debate, but that's not where the real trigger area is. That's not where the lightning and thunder occurs. The lightning and thunder occurs in large-scale human cooperation, or the cooperation amongst anonymous others. And this is really important because that's something that varies widely across human societies. So any effort to explain human cooperation has to not only explain the fact that humans are big cooperators compared to other species, so something special happened in the human lineage, but that it varies across society. So some societies don't cooperate above the family level, like the Machiganga that I worked with was basically families in the forest. All the way up to modern nation states where people cooperate on the order of thousands or millions, routinely make profitable exchanges with strangers, etc. So I've made the case that we have lots of innate instincts that shape our cooperation, but that these have been shaped by cultural evolution to allow large-scale cooperation, and that there's been a longer-term gene-culture coevolutionary process, which has left us with a psychology that is more than the small-scale cooperative psychology you'd find among non-human primates, but even that had to be ratcheted up in the last 10,000 years to build the really big societies. And that's where religion and institutions come in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and before we get into how big societies evolved or developed, let me just ask you this. So, for example, when it comes to kin and kin selection and kinship systems, I mean, it is the case that probably we are genetically endowed with the predisposition to help more our own kin, right? But then what we consider to be our kin can be culturally shaped, right? Because there are those kinds of systems where we learn who is part of our family and the sort of obligations that we have toward each of those persons,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so that's a case I've made in print, which is the going from a kin psychology and say inbreeding aversion, a pair bonding psychology in terms of mating, and that those are three ingredients in constructing what anthropologists call kinship systems. So this is a set of norms. So humans can acquire norms. These are culturally transmitted rules for which the violation of which can get you in trouble with other people, bad reputation, things like that. And all human societies seem to have kinship systems of some sort. And the smallest scale human societies, hunter-gatherers and whatnot, have these extensive kinship networks where it's really people want everybody to be a relative. So if a stranger does arrive and become embedded in the society, they'll get given a relationship slot. And that'll tell everybody else how to relate to them. It'll affect who they can marry and how they're supposed to treat different members of the social group. So, but I think of that as building on some innate anchors. So the kinship psychology that I mentioned, but like you might call certain cousins brother. And that means you're supposed to normatively call them like a brother. You might use the term brother for them. And that may pull them closer. It may make them feel closer to you than they would otherwise. But even if it doesn't, it tells you and everybody else how you're supposed to behave towards them. So you should be treating them like a brother. And so now we have expectations about how you're supposed to behave. So it's a way of kind of bootstrapping up probably the most primeval of human institutions.
Mm-hmm. And and probably we can introduce the topic of religion here, but do we know what was the process that human societies followed from, for example, hunter-gatherer ones up to state societies? I mean, how did they increase in complexity over time and with mechanisms or processes that came from cultural evolution? Because I guess that there must have been some added elements that wouldn't be there naturally, let's say, that allowed for human societies to expand over time, right?
Yeah. So, our data from this comes from comparative ethnography. So we have the database of anthropologists having studied diverse societies. We have reports of how societies developed in different continents after people began writing stuff down. And we have archaeological data. And increasingly, we're getting DNA data, ancient DNA data that allows us to track the movement of populations, figured out who mated with who. You can do some interesting stuff with X and Y chromosomes to figure out some class stratification. And so from that picture, it looks like there's a lot of competition among societies. And societies with better and more effective institutions that allow them to create more internal harmony and create greater cooperation, more technology too, we're able to spread at the expense of societies that didn't have that. And so this is a kind of the long run. So it's the Jared Diamond story of the evolution of human societies to some degree that allowed human societies to scale up cooperation.
Mm-hmm. And what was the role, just to rephrase the question, how important was religion in that process? Because, there's that question about what exactly we should classify as religion or religious manifestations. Like, for example, are some aspects of human behavior that we find in hunter-gatherer societies, like animism and other things like that, are they really religion? But then we also get into the question that, at least from a certain point on, it seems that societies need under quotation marks, moralizing gods for them to function properly. I mean, am I interpreting the evidence correctly, or not?
Well, let me come back to need. Need might be a little bit strong.
Okay.
Which you put it in quotes.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems of talking about religions is there's some tendency for people to get mired in the definitions.
Hmm.
So we don't have to use the word religion at all, but what we see across hunter-gatherer societies and other small-scale societies is that one of the main tools that's used to galvanize cooperations are communal rhythmic rituals. So people get together. There's some overlay of spirits and gods. There's often sacrifices. People are moving in unison. This is passed down through generations. Ancestors may involve. And there's a bunch of elements to these that we can put it in the psychology lab or elsewhere and show that it brings people together. It heals social wounds. This is how the ethnographers describe it. It increases cooperation in public goods. That's what the laboratory psychology shows. It just generally creates a good feeling of solidarity. Militaries figured this out, which is why you march your soldiers around in unison, because something about moving in sync with other members of your group makes you feel like you're an entity and you're moving together, working together, willing to sacrifice for each other. So that was actually a military innovation that made armies more effective. So we see this spread wide, but now the problem with these communal rituals is they only create cooperation amongst those attending the rituals. So they're very powerful, but they're limited. So one idea is that one of the tricks cultural evolution figured out was that it was able to create gods that were increasingly morally concerned that people should treat people in particular ways. So anything that increases cooperation, internal harmony, so we can imagine the kinds of things these gods are going to care about. They're not so worried about mothers loving their children. That's not a problem. What we got to do is, you envy a neighbor, or you got to be nice to not rob a stranger, or things like that. People that would allow your social group to be more effective economically in military conflicts and whatnot. So the idea is that there began this gradual evolution of supernatural beings and rituals to instill faith in these beings that then gradually expanded the sphere of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. And does the fact that in larger societies people do not meet and do not know even most people that many times they interact with or that are part of their own society, does that play an important role in why people need things like religion, or to believe in some sort of moralizing God that is watching over them all the time and monitoring their behavior, or even other kinds of social institutions, law systems, and things like that?
Yeah. So that's the basic idea, is that you had to get people to be willing to make trusted exchanges with distant strangers. So, in the Mediterranean, there's a great deal of need for trade, but there's a problem of trust. I'm thinking about sort of ancient history. So Greeks and Romans making trade along in the Mediterranean, and they had these altars. They would swear to various gods that they would, fulfill the contract that they were bound to. And, the idea is that based on what we know from contemporary experiments done by anthropologists and psychologists, there's good reason to think that would have, doesn't mean it made, stealing all the stuff and just running away and it never happened, but it made it less likely, which meant individuals were more likely to make a bargain and goods flowed more readily across the Mediterranean. So it's solving that basic problem of dealing with strangers, and it's also getting, armies that otherwise might be willing to only cooperate on the order of hundreds. You want to get thousands of men to fight together, and so it's trying to solve that problem too.
Mm-hmm. And there's this term prosocial religions. What is that really about? I mean, I mentioned moralizing gods. Does that have anything to do with that, or what are we exactly talking about here when we mention prosocial religion?
Yeah, prosocial religions is just these religions where the elements, rituals, gods, and other aspects of the institution are facilitating the scaling up of human societies, that are getting people to be nicer to individuals that are further from them in social distance. So co-religionists who I haven't met before, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So and now I'm going to ask you a question, and then I have a follow-up to it. Is there any society out there that exists now or has ever existed that we know about that we can call or classify as an atheistic society?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a question I've focused much on, but I do hang around people who wonder a lot about this question. Folks like Arnor and Zion, Will Gervais, and I mean, what I hear them saying is that it's possible that some of the countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries are at least tilting in that direction. The religion isn't kind of woven into the fabric of their societies. However, when you dig down a bit, many times people do have lots of spiritual, supernatural beliefs, that don't pass muster with, with lots of scientists, for example. So I think that's an open question, and it kind of depends on what you're going to count as religion and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to say something wrong here, but since religious thinking and religious behavior is the result of several different cognitive mechanisms that we have, and it has to do with different aspects of human sociality and how we should interact with one another and cooperate and compete and etc. I mean, don't we get into a point where it's really hard to say if, for example, if someone is an atheist, but that probably that person also, I'm not sure if believe is the right word to use here, but at least has the same kind of basic underlying psychology that would allow for those kinds of behaviors to occur. I mean, just to rephrase the question, that probably even someone who calls himself an atheist probably is under the influence of the same kinds of mechanisms and biases and all that, and those kinds of things that a theistic person is.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of the things where, it's hard because it might be you have, ghosts are an interesting case because, there's none of the contemporary modern, well, for the most part, there's a few exceptions, kind of promote the notion of ghosts. And of course, scientists don't think there are any ghosts. But ghosts, 50% of Americans will still tell you they believe in ghosts. So, it's sort of lurking out there. Nobody's really supporting it, but there's enough powerful mechanisms that people come up with the idea that there might be ghosts around. Mm-hmm. So there's that kind of stuff. And then there's also, I mean, this isn't religion by my definition, but atheists like myself are willing to commit to ideas like universal human rights. Now, I can't tell you why I believe in human universal rights. I just do, and I consider that a foundational belief. So in some sense, I put faith in that as being something I should believe in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens* even called human rights, for example, a sort of religion. I mean, I know that from an anthropological perspective, that's not really right to say, I guess, but in another, on the other hand, it's interesting because believing in human rights, for example, has some of the same elements as believing in something that is superior to us, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And this is in my book, The Secret of Our Success. I try to lay the foundation for why humans can have religion by really coming at it from another direction, which is to say we're a cultural species. And we put faith in the ideas, the valued ideas and beliefs that the previous generation passes down to us. It doesn't mean we're also selective. So it might be that we're putting the faith in what the prestigious individuals in the previous generation passed down to us. And so that's where, that could be useful for making tools, for building institutions and all that kind of stuff. And so the faith is actually very fundamental to being human, putting faith in what you culturally learn from others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just to go back a little bit in your work and the work you've done with other people, you talk a lot, you talk about the cultural brain hypothesis. So could you tell us what is that about?
Yeah, so the interesting puzzle with humans is that our brains were not particularly larger than other primates about 2 million years ago. And then there's this relatively rapid expansion of brains that we don't see in other animals. So the question is, what can explain the rapid expansion of human brains, along with the details? What are those brains doing? What are they for? What's the cognition that it's being selected for? So myself and some of my colleagues, in particular Michael Muthu Krishna, have considered the idea that culture may have been the driving force. So once you begin to get cumulative culture, you need a brain that can reach out and tap all the valuable information, how to use medicinal plants, how to find underground tubers, how to make fire, how to make spears, lots of social strategies one can learn from others. And then the better your brain gets at acquiring, storing, and organizing this cultural information, the more there is out there that accumulates in the minds of others, and the more you need a bigger brain capable of doing all these things. And so in some sense, our brains evolved rapidly to be a cultural storage and acquisition mechanism. And the fun thing about this, if you model this with a computer simulation or some, you can also have some analytic models, it's autocatalytic. So once you cross a certain threshold, you'll get more culture, bigger brains, more culture, bigger brains, because the two things are feeding back on each other. And we think this is a viable hypothesis for driving the human brain expansion.
Yeah. So do you think that in a given society, individual intelligence is really that important or not?
Well, I think that, again, this is something we've studied. We call it the collective brain, which is that the larger and more interconnected your brains, the faster you can generate cumulative cultural evolution. So fancier technologies, more sophisticated languages, larger cultural repertoires. And when you model this, it turns out that the most important factor is the size and interconnectedness of the minds, and that the actual specifics of how smart each mind is relatively less important. It's not unimportant. But in terms of, you can imagine increasing the intelligence of everybody by 10% or increasing the interconnectedness of everybody by 10%. And the interconnectedness, having more information flowing among minds is much more important than making one person individually more smarter. And I think the simplest way to see that is imagine everybody was completely unconnected, so every human is an island. You increase your chances of learning something by 10%, you only have a 10% likelihood you're going to have this tool. But if you're all interconnected, you just need one person to have that idea, and then everybody gets it. So that's the kind of effect that really powers human technological growth.
Mm-hmm. So what are the kinds of ideas that you have about IQ, or to be even more specific about how people in the West think about IQ and individual intelligence and the importance of it? Because I guess that, for example, in the US, I know that people are very focused on IQ, and you have the SATs, and you have to do all of those sorts of IQ tests to get into college, for example. That's not the case in Portugal, but I mean, people still they talk about, for example, geniuses and people that, almost from nowhere bring about new revolutionary ideas and things like that. And if we compare that with societies from Eastern Asia, for example, they are much more collectivistic, and people there don't seem to think that individual intelligence, or that the individual himself can do that much without other people. So would you say that maybe that the fact that we focus so much on those kinds of things like individual intelligence, IQ, geniuses and stuff like that is a bias that we can associate with what we will talk about next, weird psychology?
Yeah, so I do think that is an individualism bias, and thinking about individuals and focusing on them as having dispositions and kind of always evaluating everybody to where they are on which attributes and whatnot they have leads us into what's called the myth of the heroic inventor. And that's the idea that the great advances in technology and innovation are the products of individual minds that kind of just burst forth and give us these wonderful inventions. But if you look at the history of innovation, what you find time after time was that there was lucky recombinations. People often invent stuff at the same time, and each individual only makes a small increment to a much larger, longer process. But like with the light bulb, at least in America, we give Edison credit, but there were 27 or 43 different light bulbs before Edison did it. He was the one that commercialized it and made it profitable. In England, I think it's Joseph Swan that invented the light bulb. In Russia, there's another guy. Just because there was people all over the world working on this same problem and swapping lots of valuable information. So it's very common that you'll find that the person who we credit with something was actually just in a much longer chain. Something like calculus, it's invented twice, once by Leibniz and once by Newton. And that double invention means that there's ideas percolating around the cultural system. So somebody is going to put the pieces together, which is why you often get double and triple invention. Darwin comes up with natural selection at the same time Wallace does. And it turns out there was a bunch of other people who came up with similar ideas around the same time. So it was just that the time is right.
Mm-hmm. So,
and in terms of IQ, that's a little bit of a different story, but related. It's related to this idea of seeing attributes and dispositions, seeing them as intrinsic to the person. I have some research with some colleagues, Helen Davis and Michael Muthu Krishna, and we think that IQ is more like a kind of cognitive adaptation to your social milieu. So somewhere like the U.S., it's a cognitive adaptation to succeed in this environment, in the kinds of tasks that get you high-paying jobs and whatnot. So we can imagine in a different environment, a different set of cognitive abilities would be brought forth, and being good at whatever's on an IQ test wouldn't be a good predictor of being successful in a hunter-gatherer society or any other kind or another kind of society. And one of the things that we can show is that just giving people a small amount of schooling can have a big effect on their IQ. So going from 0 to a few years, at least based on our preliminary data, this comes from Helen Davis, has a big effect on these cognitive abilities. So IQ is very much a product of cultural evolution, not just in that there are techniques for increasing your IQ, but we shouldn't think of it as intelligence in some dispositional genetic sense, but rather specialization for a particular cultural environment for which the brain's sufficiently plastic that it would look totally different under a different set of conditions with different incentives.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's very interesting because, I know from studies done in behavioral genetics that IQ is heritable at least to a certain point, like 50%, and I guess that when people grow up and they become adults, it's around 70%. But from an evolutionary perspective, a genetic evolutionary perspective, it wouldn't make much sense for IQ the variation in IQ between different populations in different parts of the world to be explained completely by genetic evolution and by people being exposed to different environments, because I guess that higher intelligence would always give an advantage to every individual and society in any kind of environment.
Yeah, okay, so several things there. So first, lots of things are heritable. So golfing skill and basketball are also highly heritable. Because there are ingredients which are affected by our genes, which are going to be utilized in any kind of skilled task. So think of getting a high IQ score as more like being good at backgammon or being a good golfer. It's something, this is a weird cultural product, golfing, and I have some things that are shaped by genetic variation that help me to become a good golfer. So the sort of more rudimentary genetic variation that may influence IQ could feed into different cognitive skills and create different patterns of variation. And it's also worth noting that, along the point I made about IQ being an adaptation, a culturally evolved cognitive adaptation to the contemporary milieu, is the fact that the heritability, IQ scores have been going up over the 20th century in the U.S. So, Americans of 1900 would look really stupid that have an IQ of 70 compared to contemporary Americans. And that's because people have been adapting to the world of the institutions of contemporary America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you agree when, for example, James Flynn talks about the Flynn effect and says that just simply by being exposed to some cultural tools, like, for example, the education system, that people's intelligence goes up.
Yeah, so it's the education system, and there's all kinds of interesting ways which it feeds in. So if you look at television shows in the U.S., it used to be that there were a small number of characters. There was one plot per show. Each show is unconnected from the next one, except the same characters reappeared. Now you have these shows that are long, there's 20 subplots, 50 characters, all interweaving stories, right? So you've got to have a lot of mental stuff going on to track all this stuff through time. So just the sort of even the boring cultural stuff that we're tracking is getting more complicated and more cognitively demanding than it used to be.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So do you think that when, I mean, people say that there are some programs, some TV programs that dumb people down, do you think that they might have a point there?
Well, I think there are. I mean, yeah, I think they're. I'm open to both possibilities. I think there are programs that dumb people down, but I also think that the entertainment system, the entertainment offerings are going to depend on the kinds of minds people have. And as people get interested in certain topics or have better memories or can track all these things, have the mental resources, the entertainment will adapt to that. And then you get a co-evolution, because then you're a young kid, you're like, okay, I'm tracking that character, he's related to his. And so then you get better at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so let's get into the topic of weird psychology. Weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So, where does this come from? I mean, how did you arrive at this weird psychology, and what is it about exactly?
Yeah, so in the 20-aughts, Art Noran Zion and Steve Heine and myself, so they are social and cultural psychologists, we began to put our heads together. We realized that in each of the domains we were experts in, that not only were the subjects most commonly used by psychologists, so we called those weird subjects, so Western subjects, typically undergraduates though, at least at that time, that they were psychologically unusual and that they were often at the extreme ends of distribution. So if you had more than two populations, the two populations tended to clump more together. It doesn't mean there wasn't any differences, but the Westerners tended to be on the greater extreme. So we wrote this paper 10 years ago now called The Weirdest People in the World, in which we made the case that psychology, behavioral economics, and related experimental disciplines had got a distorted view of human psychology and behavior by using primarily Western undergraduates. So in psychology, 70% of subjects at the time were American undergraduates, and then 90%, over 90%, 96% were Westerners. So that gives you a really distorted picture, almost no representation from Africa, Oceania, places like that. And then, yeah, so that's what that means. And it seems to be across a large number of domains, not all domains. And that doesn't mean there's not universals, and there hasn't been evidence of universals, but it means that if you just do experiments with undergraduates, you can't be confident that your results will generalize.
Mm-hmm. And what are some of the main domains where weird psychology differs from, I mean, the other kinds of psychology, or what makes it special? We've already talked about individualistic thinking, analytic versus holistic thinking, that Westerners are more analytic, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and what are some of the other domains where it differs the most from the others?
Well, we also talked about another one, which was visual illusions. Yeah. So the Muller-Lyer illusion, people from industrialized societies are different, although Westerners are clumped with the rest of the industrialized societies. Something like conformity and obedience. So within psychology, there's the Asch conformity test, where people are tested to see how willing they are to overrule their own perceptions to go along with peers. And that's something that varies quite a bit among societies. The Westerners are at the extreme end of the distribution of not conforming. One interesting thing about this, it kind of points to the fact that psychology is constructed as things that surprise weird professors or weird people. So I like to think that if the Asch conformity test had been discovered in Japan or in Fiji, people wouldn't have been shocked by it. So it wouldn't have been something that became a textbook finding. It's interesting if you're an individualist that people are willing to conform to others and say the wrong thing. But in lots of places, that's not that interesting. It's not surprising. So the use of intentions, so the importance of intentions and moral judgments is something that varies a lot across societies. Westerners are very concerned with inferring underlying mental states. So you see that in some experimental work. Something called the fundamental attribution error which is the tendency to attribute dispositions or traits of the individual to explain their behavior as opposed to focusing on the circumstance. So if somebody slips on the floor, it's because they were clumsy instead of there was water on the floor, something like that.
So let me just interrupt you there. Is it the case then that the fundamental attribution error, we can't find it in non-weird societies? Is that it? Or
the evidence is that it's weaker and sometimes not there.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So in this case, the Western societies are at the extreme of the fundamental attribution error. They're also at the extreme of using intentions and moral judgment. So if somebody accidentally steals someone's bag because they were mistaken versus intentionally steals it, Westerners make a big distinction about that. Other populations are less inclined. I mean, the person lost his stuff. Maybe you shouldn't have been so careless to take their bag by mistake. So there's that. And there's things like trust, what I call impersonal prosociality, so willingness to trust strangers and trust institutions. There's a lot of evidence there. You mentioned the analytic versus holistic thinking. Emotions, so shame and guilt. Westerners tend to be heavy on the guilt and rather light on the shame. So anthropologists have long described lots of shame societies. But now there's some real evidence that Westerners are concerned with guilt, it means violations of their own personal standards, not living up to the image of themselves that they've set. Whereas in a shame society, you're concerned about living up to what the society wants.
Okay, so let me ask you this. These aspects of psychology that we talked about, like, for example, perceptual illusions, space orientation, analytic versus holistic thinking, individualistic thinking, and things like that. Do you know if it's the case that all of these psychological mechanisms have some sort of aspects in common that render them more malleable or permeable to culture than others, and then there are other aspects that are not that malleable or not?
Yeah, it's interesting because this is what you just described is a common intuition, I think, that many psychologists have, and I think it comes from the application of a kind of computer metaphor to the brain. Mm-hmm. So this, one of the problems with the cognitive revolution, it's great to think about the brain as an information processor. It's bad to use your desktop computer as the model. And that has a software-hardware distinction, which brains don't actually have. So we don't have a good theory to tell us what the most basic processes are. And so one of the games that we kind of played in our BBS paper was to say, okay, you give us a domain where you think is a basic process, and we'll go to the empirical record and see if you can find that. And it's not the case with verbal memory. It's not the case with short-term memory. It's not the case with autobiographical memory. All these things are heavily affected. It's not the case with intentions. It's not the case with visual perceptions. It's not the case with sense. I'm still open for someone to give me the criterion for which I can identify those basic features of cognition that are impenetrable. So that's an open challenge. Now, just to give you some examples of why that might be tricky is because if you take something like learning to read, when you learn to read, you get a thicker corpus callosum, which means when you hear speech, you get more whole brain activation. You get specialized circuitry in your left hemisphere. This may push into your fusiform gyrus in the left hemisphere and may explain why we think that face processing occurs in the right hemisphere, because our reading module basically takes some neurogeography from our face recognition. So non-literate people don't have that asymmetry. So there's just lots of interesting things that our brains reshape themselves as they adapt to our cultural milieu.
Mm-hmm. But isn't it the case that, brain plasticity has some limits, and it's also the ways by which brains can be modified by being exposed to different environmental factors, to different information? That also is, I wouldn't like to use the expression genetically determined, but at least limited by the way the brain is structured or organized.
So there's got to be huge limitations. One idea that's been put out is that our writing systems look a particular way because our ability to process the words quickly is constrained by all kinds of details about how we see things. So I expect that to be hugely important. So I didn't mean to suggest that there's some kind of limitless to the plasticity of the brain. But in terms of the way that cognitive science and psychology often think about, quote, basic processes versus other kinds of processes, I don't think that's carving it up the right way. I mean, I'm open, but I haven't seen evidence to suggest that that's the right carving. And the basic stuff is things like attention and memory, and then the other stuff is not basic.
Okay, and do you think that in terms of psychology that we can talk about human nature? I mean, what I mean by this is, do you think that there are at least some basic aspects of our psychology that, independently of the kinds of environments, the kinds of ecological conditions, cultural information that people are exposed to, are always present in people's minds, or not?
Oh, yeah, a huge amount of stuff. So we've talked about three of them. We talked about kinship, this kin-based altruism. Inbreeding emergence seems to develop in most societies. I mean, I think it would develop in all societies, but there are certain social conditions which means it doesn't develop. And pair bonding. So almost all societies have marriage, and the ones that don't, it's kind of obvious why they don't. And then, lots of ways we interpret the world, the way we think about plants and animals. We seem to have a specialized way of thinking about artifacts that reliably develops. Status, so you find prestige and dominance in every society. So, yeah, so there's a whole host of things.
When you mentioned plants and animals, you were referring to what some people in anthropology call folk biology.
Right, folk biology. So thinking about dividing plants and animals into what we might think of as species, or technical term is folk generics, and endowing them with properties. So if you learn something about one lion, you see him hunting at night, you think that all lions hunt at night. So automatic category-based induction. The idea is that species are also resistant to superficial transformation. So if I take a chair and I change it into a table and ask you, is that still a chair or is it a table now? You're like, well, it's a table now. But if I take a cat and turn it into looking like a skunk, and then is that a cat or a skunk? A kid doesn't say it's the skunk. He thinks it's still a cat. It just looks like a skunk now. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that kind of essentialistic thinking that we find across societies, right?
Yeah, and I've done a lot of folk biological research in Fiji, and I found the same properties when I asked Fijians, adults and kids, thinking about different marine species.
Okay, so I mean, I've had Cecilia Heyes on the show, and I know that you and other people commented on some of her ideas, or at least the way she interprets data about, for example, biased learning, about imitation, about mind reading or theory of mind. So overall, and since you think that at least, or the evidence points toward some aspects of our psychology being the result of cultural evolution, I mean, what do you think about her ideas? For example, a theory of mind, because it's a big deal that we have these, what was before called, I guess, folk psychology, right? And that we think about us as individuals and other people as individuals, and then the collective and things like that. Do you agree that some of these cognitive gadgets, as she calls them, are really products of cultural evolution, or that they are more basilar than that?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that I think that Celia doesn't appreciate the degree to which, folks like me and others have made the case that cultural evolution produces all kinds of mental gadgets. So we were just talking about my book, and I was laying out for you all the ways in which cultural evolution has shaped conformity and individualism and overconfidence and social preferences. And so I certainly, on board before Celia first wrote about it, that culture was shaping people's minds. So then the question is, does it shape theory of mind? And so Clark Barrett and I have done research, and I told you about some stuff, how the use of intentions and moral judgments. So that's a case where we think that culture has shaped the application of theory of mind to a specific domain. But we've also done research showing that you see elements of theory of mind appearing in babies, in China and in Fiji and in Western babies. So we, as early, looking at babies, we already see some elements of theory of mind. We see theory of mind widely used, even in societies where it's suppressed. So there's a phenomenon in anthropology called opacity of mind. And societies in the Pacific and other places have social norms which say you're not supposed to use theory of mind. So if a child makes reference to another person's mental states, the mom will correct the child and just re-describe the behavior according to the superficial aspects, so what the person did, not what the person felt. And I've seen this in Fiji. When I ask a question, how did so-and-so feel about this, people will often answer my question by not inferring mental states. They'll answer the question by just telling me what they did, right? Mm-hmm. So despite this top-down input from moms, when you actually do mentalizing tests on Fijians, which I've done, they're quite good at mentalizing. They're perfectly good at mentalizing. So this is a case where the socialization runs in the opposite direction that you would expect, and yet you still get powerful theory of mind and can pass all the theory of mind tests and whatnot. So I just think that the empirical evidence runs against what Celia is saying. Mm-hmm. A lot of it done by cultural evolutionists like Clark Barrett and myself.
Yeah, sure. And that's interesting because we also have to be careful, if I'm not mistaken, when studying particularly other societies, because it's not always the case that because some aspect of psychology is not evidently present there, that people are not endowed with it. Sometimes people suppress some of our aspects of our psychological, mechanisms, let's say, or something like that, right?
Yeah. So one case where that comes out, and it really reminds you that you got to watch your methods, is we did these mirror self-recognition tasks, which are used in non-humans, dolphins and chimpanzees, to show that they have self-recognition. But when we did mirror self-recognition with Kenyan kids, they just didn't respond. So you put the post-it on their head, and the idea is you slip it there serendipitously, and if a chimp will go, oh, what's this thing on my head? The Kenyan kids just sat there. They didn't move. And so it's not that I don't think that they have mirror self-recognition. I think that there's a task problem, and that the kids are sitting there with some Western experimenter, and they're kind of frozen, so they don't move. So you get the wrong answer when you do the task. And I think that, Celia points to some of these theory of mind tasks, false belief tasks, that seem to appear at different ages. And I think that's just, experimenter noise, basically. There could be some developmental delays, but it's just like walking. You can also look at the development of walking, and that appears at different times in different societies. And I don't know anyone who wants to argue that walking is not a product of evolution, as we haven't been shaped to be walkers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly. So, okay, let me just ask you about one last topic. What is your take on group selection? Because nowadays there are people that talk about genetic group selection, about cultural group selection, and then there are people that think that both of them exist, other people that defend that only cultural group selection exists. So what is your take on that topic?
Yeah, so my take is that I've argued in print against the likelihood that genetic group selection is very important for shaping human social behavior. And the reason that I'm suspect of that, a couple different reasons, but one is a theoretical reason mixed with a little bit of empirical evidence. So when you look at these models of genetic group selection, they rely on maintaining genetic variance between groups. So you have to have groups that maintain different genes. And a problem in maintaining that is if you have gene flow between the groups. Now we look at traditional human societies when they have warfare and conflict, and what often happens is one side wins and they kill all the men and take all the women as mates of some kind. And that creates massive gene flow. That sort of completely remixes the groups in terms of genes. So that's going to kill any genetic differences between the groups. So that means genetic group selection is unlikely. Now, I also think if you look at the data and you compete a genetic group selection story against a cultural group selection story, the evidence on the nature of people's psychology is more supportive of the cultural side. So cultural doesn't have this migration problem because humans have social norms. So if you migrate into a new group, I keep the same genes, but I have to change my behavior because I'm going to get punished or sanctioned or a bad reputation, sort of things like that. So that preserves the variation between groups. Some groups do things one way, some they have bride price, other groups have dowry, some groups have segmentary lineages, other groups don't. And so there's this preserved variation between the groups. And then competition among those groups over time is going to favor those collection of norms that allow them to outcompete other groups and survive. And people internalize social norms to become motivations in themselves. So that means a lot of our psychology is dependent on the norms we acquire growing up. So whether we trust strangers or how we feel about male-female inequality, things like that. So when you study different human societies, one of the challenges is, as I mentioned earlier, is to explain why you have some highly cooperative groups and groups that are not so cooperative. And if we were genetically group selected, it's not obvious why there would be that difference. But if this was just cultural group selection, it's just that we have very different norms. And if you grow up in one place, you get one set of norms. If you grow up in another place, you get a different set of norms. And then, of course, you can test that by when people migrate. So people have migrated to the US, for example, from all over the world. And first-generation migrants look different. Second-generation migrants look less different. And by the time you get to third and fourth-generation migrants, it's a big mix. And you can't tell someone's behavior by looking back at the home country anymore. So there's a lot of work in economics on this. So that suggests that it's just an adaptation to the local institutions, the local norms.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of cultural group selection, since, one of the things at least that happens is that different groups have different norms, they promote different behaviors, and then some are successful and some aren't, and when they compete with one another, the one that has the best norms to follow or the best institutions or something like that wins over the other, and basically people die out or they get conquered or something like that and integrated into the new group. How do you factor in things like, for example, migrations and the flow of people between different groups? Because I would guess that that's really complex, because different people from different places bring with them different ideas that sometimes even change the societies they move into, right? So, do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
I think so. So one element to keep in mind, though, is that you don't have to have violent conflict or anything like that between groups. Mm-hmm. One of the mechanisms of group selection that Boyd and Richardson have modeled and that I've talked about is kind of a biased migration. So imagine you have two societies, one is economically successful and one is not. Individuals are going to bias to migrate into the more successful society. They go there, they have kids, the kids acquire the local norms, that maintains the institutions in the more successful group. And then that group prospers. If they're bringing their own individuality and own good ideas, then those can help that group proliferate too. So that's a kind of cultural group selection, because it's what's driving it are the average differences in the economic performance of the two societies. You don't have people migrating from the richer society to the poorer society. So, and another kind of institution is you're saying that the ideas of the migrants affect the group. Well, there's actually institutions which foster that. So sometimes groups could be put into, isolated from everybody else in some kind of caste system. That's not going to foster the use of the diversity of ideas that migrants bring. If you have institutions that cause the remixing of ideas and harness the migrants. So a lot of the innovation in the U.S. during the 19th and 20th century can be traced to migrations. So migrants come from all around the world. This energizes the innovation engine in the U.S. and helps propel a lot of American innovation. So that's a case where having a certain kind of institution really leads to greater economic performance.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and isn't it also interesting that via cultural group selection, one of the ways by which we can measure, if I'm not mistaken, success is the fact that societies grow over time in terms of number of people, right? So at least one of the ways by which we measure success translates also into biological or genetic evolutionary success, right? Just by increasing the number of individuals.
Right. So I'd put aside the genetic success and just say one way you can do cultural evolution is to just keep account of the ideas, the beliefs, and the commitments in individual minds. So if we're just doing a survey, say, of the number of people who believe in democracy or a number of people who believe in human rights, then those things are spreading rapidly, given that they were zero a few centuries ago. So in that sense, and some of that is being driven by the societies that adopted those became relatively prosperous.
Yeah. Okay, so Dr. Henrich, we've already covered a lot of topics from your work. As I said before, let's see if later in the summer we can schedule another interview to focus simply on your upcoming book that will be out in September. And just before we go, would you like to tell people, apart from the books I mentioned in the introduction, what are some of the best places on the internet for them to find your work?
Well, my lab has a YouTube channel and my website at Harvard. If you just type Joseph Henrich into Google, you'll find me. That's where all my papers and stuff are.
Mm-hmm. Do you have some ResearchGate profile, academia.edu or something like that?
No. I think the paper should be accessible from my website.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I will include links to your work in the description box of the interview, and also to your other book, The Secret of Our Success, which is very interesting. And Dr. Henrich, as I said in the beginning, it was really an honor to meet you and to talk to you, and thank you for taking the time to be on the show.
Great. Thanks a lot, Ricardo.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litska and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers is our Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.